Many of you may have seen Michael Gove's recent speech, in which, no doubt influenced by Dominic Cummings, he explained that what was required in the civil service of the future was people who understood Monte Carlo methods and Bayesian statistics. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with either Monte Carlo methods or Bayesian statistics. If you're not and you want to know, and if you're not and you really want to know, I'll be happy to take questions on this at the end. But I'm not going to give a lecture on that. But both Monte Carlo methods and Bayesian statistics are predicated on the ability to apply probabilistic type reasoning widely. And the thesis of Radical Uncertainty, the book which I've written with Mervyn King, the thesis is that we are currently applying probabilistic reasoning too extensively, and that while it's a useful tool, actually it's not the best way in general of thinking about uncertainty. So that's the thesis. And I might begin in 2011, when Obama is in the White House debating with his colleagues whether or not to order the raid on the compound in Abbottabad, where it's thought bin Laden is hiding. And after the failures of intelligence in the Iraq wars, intelligence agencies in the US were told, in future you have to express your judgments in probabilistic terms. Now, the big problem for Obama is the question of, is the man whom spy satellites have observed in the compound, is that bin Laden or is it not? And different people come up, from different agencies, come up with different estimates of probability. And these estimates range from 25% to 95%. And at the end of this, Obama throws his hands in the air and says, look, guys, it's a flip of the coin, isn't it? It's 50-50. By which I'm pretty sure he did not mean the chance that the person in the Abbottabad compound is bin Laden is 0.5. What he meant was, we don't know whether it's bin Laden or not, but I have to make a decision anyway. And that's the situation which we all too frequently face. It's certainly a situation which Obama faced. And he went on to say after that, and giving an interview after the raid had been successfully conducted, people kept coming to me with these probabilities, and they served actually to disguise uncertainty rather than to illuminate it. So our thesis is that the ways in which we use probability are inappropriate and too extensive. And one curious thing we discovered is that probabilistic reasoning is something that emerged really rather recently in the history of human thought, in the 17th century, as a matter of fact. And it was developed in the 17th century for gamblers. It was how you solved problems at the gaming tables. In fact, the story of the first probabilistic mathematics tells of a French aristocrat called the Chevalier de Meur asking a French remarkable mathematician and polymath called Fermat whether he could help with this. And Fermat discussed it with an even more remarkable French polymath, Pascal, and together they came up with the basics of the theory of probability as applied to gambling. That's in the 17th century. And it was then applied, and what's remarkable about this really is that the Greeks and Romans gambled. They had people who were really rather good at mathematics, but they never thought of applying the mathematics to these kind of issues. And really until the 17th century, people didn't even have a concept of probability. The historian Gibbon, writing about the fall of Rome, talked about Hannibal crossing the Alps, if indeed Hannibal did cross the Alps on elephants, and said, in respect of that, the account of Livy has more of probability, while the account of Polybius has more of truth. And that seems a very puzzling remark to us nowadays. But the reason is that what probability meant, really until about the 18th century, was probability is what right-thinking people think or believe. And the idea that there was some objective reality out there that was not simply a matter of people's beliefs, was a product of that 17th and 18th century Enlightenment. And what we're saying is that the belief that there is some objective reality out there has actually been taken a bit too far. But actually, after this mathematics was invented, it was extended more and more. It was first of all used for insurance and fire and marine insurance and for mortality tables. And in the late 19th century, it became applied much more widely. The Guinness brewing family in the late 19th century realized that what they needed was smart young people to help them run their business. And one of the people they recruited was a Cambridge graduate called William Gossett, who actually published various articles defining the theory of probability under the pseudonym of Student. And if you learn about probability now as a student, you will be taught at an early stage all about Student's T as a probability statistics. He was actually employed to control quality at the Guinness Brewery in Dublin. And he invented this kind of technique as a method of modeling, appraising quality. And actually, a probability has been more and more used in this way for routine manufacturing processes like brewing. And many of you will have heard of Motorola and General Electric, so-called Six Sigma. That Six Sigma come from probability theory. But right at the very early stages in the 20th century, there were people who were skeptical about this extensive use of probability. Rosie, could we have the first slide here?
A measurable uncertainty, or risk proper, as we shall use the term, is so far different from an unmeasurable one that it is not, in effect, an uncertainty at all.
What Knight was doing was criticizing the way in which people were increasingly using probability to talk about more or less everything when there was uncertainty. And Knight argued that it was actually, that's the reason for the title of his book, that it was actually the existence of uncertainty that gave opportunities for entrepreneurship and was a source of profit. And actually, by coincidence, in the same year, a very different book was published by a very different economist, Maynard Keynes. It was called A Treatise on Probability. And what Keynes said, which echoes Knight, was, next slide, please.
By uncertain knowledge, I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probability. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper, or the rate of interest in 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of invention, or the position of private wealth owners in the social system in 1970. About these matters, there is no scientific basis to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know.
But actually, over the next 25 years, Keynes and Knight lost that argument, and probability went on being more and more extensively applied. In the late 1940s, this kind of thinking was really taken over by a group of Americans, von Neumann and Morgenstern, the people, as a matter of fact, who invented Monte Carlo methods, if we come back to that, wrote about this. And then two Chicago economists, Milton Friedman, and a statistician called Jimmy Savage, set out an axiomatic treatment of probability, which said we can apply a probability to any risky situation, whatever. Now, many of you will have heard of behavioral economics. And the beginning of behavioral economics happened actually at a dinner party in Paris in 1952, around a conference which had been organized to talk about the ways in which people were then thinking about risk and uncertainty. Next slide, please. That's just an introduction to the City of Light. Let's go on and see that dinner party. It was a particularly erudite dinner party, because 4 of the 6 people in this particular table went on to win Nobel Prizes. The French economist who was the host, Maurice Allais, Norwegian, Ragnar Frisch, Paul Samuelson, probably the greatest economist of the second half of the 20th century, and of course Milton Friedman. And what Allais did at that dinner party was he posed people to the participants, a series of gambles. And he got them to he accumulated their views on these various choices. And at the end of it, he showed them that they had violated the axioms of probability, which were becoming the standard theory of how you think about risk and uncertainty. That, as I say, was the beginning of behavioral economics. It was observing that economists could develop models of rationality, but they didn't necessarily describe how people actually behaved. Now, the conclusion which Allais drew, and the people at that dinner party were also invited to do and largely did, was that these axioms of rationality were not in fact axioms of rationality at all. They weren't descriptive of rational behavior because people had good reasons for making the different choices which they did. But that wasn't how things panned out subsequently. Behavioral economics became not a critique of a model of rationality, but a critique of the people. It's, I'm afraid, a tendency of economists to say that if the world is not like our model, the problem lies with the model rather than with the world. The problem lies with the world rather than with the model. And by the 1960s, Friedman, who was never in doubt about very much, was very clear about this. Next slide, please.
In his seminal work, Frank Knight drew a sharp distinction between risk as referring to events subject to a known or knowable probability distribution, and uncertainty as referring to events for which it was not possible to specify numerical probabilities. I have not referred to this distinction because I do not believe it is valid. I follow Jimmy Savage in his view of personal probability, which denies any valid distinction along these lines. We may treat people as if they assigned numerical probabilities to every conceivable event.
And it's hard to exaggerate the influence of that kind of thinking on policy in a variety of areas. This is the basis of almost all of modern finance theory. It's the basis of the currently dominant school of thinking about macroeconomic modeling. It's behind a great deal of the kind of modeling that is now undertaken by various firms of consultants. And of course, it's what lies behind Monte Carlo simulation and Bayesian statistics, which might be a moment to give you a chance to take a break and catch your breath.
In the audience, John, we've got a good friend, David Cooper, who's been listening to this with absolute enthusiasm. David, this is your province. What comments or observations might you have on what John said so far?
I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is the emotional component to all of this, and how, I completely agree that these ideas which are taken for granted are really artifacts of the sort of post-Enlightenment period. And before the Enlightenment, I think our whole conception of the future as something that could somehow be accessed or predicted was very, very different. I think in pre-Enlightenment days, the consensus was that the future just sort of lands upon us. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on the emotional component of this and how, you know, maybe beneath the surface, there is quite a lot of comfort to be derived from the idea that we live in a world where which can be reduced to numbers and probabilities. And this gives us a sense of the idea that we can predict things and calculate things, provides a sense of comfort and reassurance, which is far preferable to sort of confronting the idea that we live in an essentially chaotic and unpredictable world, and how this may be one of the factors which has perpetuated some of these ideas, which when you look at the quotes, don't really seem to make a lot of sense.
I think what you said, David, about pre-Enlightenment thinking in this kind of area is very much to the point. As far as we can see, a large part of the reason why people didn't think probabilistically was that there was no such thing as chance, really, in the sense in which we now mean it. There was only the will of the gods, as it were. What was going to happen was determined. And you might not know what it was going to be, but it was nevertheless the product of some underlying determinism. And that's an idea that continues to be important and influential. It's very much the heart of Einstein's famous comment, God does not play dice. But that historic view also explains why these people in ancient times did things that seem utterly extraordinary to us now, like consulting the Oracle of Delphi, or the entrails of slain beasts, in a belief that somehow or other this would give you greater insight into the will of the gods, and hence know what was going to happen. I'm not sure that what people are doing now is really so different from consulting the entrails, but it gives that elements of that same feeling of false reassurance which you described. But this also leads into what is really the second part of my talk, which is a question of how do people really think about uncertainty, and what do and should they actually do instead? Because the truth is, people find probabilistic reasoning really quite hard. We were talking just before this call began about the Linda problem, which is one of the famous exercises in behavioral economics. And the Linda problem runs something like this. Linda is single, young, was active in demonstrations of various progressive causes, read sociology at Anglia Polytechnic University. Which of the following do you think is more likely? One, Linda is a bank manager. Linda's a bank manager who is active in the Woman in Banking feminist network, or woman is a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front. And I've tried this on various audiences. It's probably too hard to do this on Zoom, though thinking about it, we could have set up a poll on it. But actually, in my experience, you get audiences dividing about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for each of these. And that's been true even of audiences of actuaries, which ought to be on top of probability. Now, the smart Kahneman-Tversky answer to this is that the only answer which makes any sense is that Linda is a bank manager, because it can't be more likely that Linda is both a bank manager and an active feminist than that Linda's a bank manager, because there are plainly many bank managers who are not active feminists. And it's much more likely that any randomly selected person is a bank manager than that they are a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front, because there are tens of thousands of bank managers and perhaps 2 spokespeople for the Animal Liberation Front. So the answer, Linda is a bank manager and a feminist, or Linda's in the Animal Liberation Front. These answers are just ridiculous. But the interesting thing about that exercise is people are not convinced even after you explain the reasoning to them. And the reason for that, I think, is perfectly clear. People don't think in terms of probabilities when they think about uncertainty. They think in terms of stories. And two of these three stories have a kind of coherence that makes sense. Whereas for me to end that description of Linda and to walk out of the room and say, meet Linda, she's a bank manager at NatWest Bank, is there's something wrong with that. There's something not quite coherent about that. You wonder if you've heard right. There's something that needs to be explained. People think in terms of stories and narratives rather than probabilistic terms. And they do so really for good reasons, for good evolutionary reasons. And we devote a lot of discussion to evolutionary rationality as distinct from axiomatic rationality. Axiomatic rationality is what's true of a small world in which all problems are well defined, they have correct solutions, and you can tell people whether people are arriving at these correct solutions or not. And more than that, people will generally agree on what is the correct solution after the event. But most of the things that we deal with in real life are not actually like that. The problems are ill-defined, and we may not know what the right answer to them is even after the event. That's the real world, and that's the world of radical uncertainty. Now, part of the problem we have nowadays, I think, is that we use terminology rather casually. Economists and people who reason in these kind of ways, the devotees of Monte Carlo methods and Bayesian statistics, have this Friedman-Savage, von Neumann-Morgenstern concept of rationality, which is defined by accordance with a series of axioms, normative axioms about how they think people ought to behave. But in complicated worlds which you only imperfectly understand, it's far from clear that that's what one means by rationality. And the terminology which we're now using applies to these kind of small worlds. Could we have the next slide, please?
In his seminal work, Frank Knight drew a sharp...
Right, there are really four words which people use almost interchangeably right nowadays, but they're not interchangeable. First is likelihood, which is determined by our general knowledge of the world. So I can say that if we take one question which has been asked in a number of experiments, is Philadelphia the capital city of Pennsylvania? Now, it makes sense to say it's likely, if you don't know the answer to that question, it's likely that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania, because Philadelphia is the largest town in Pennsylvania. It's the business and commercial center. And there's a general rule that it's likely that the largest town in the state or a country is its capital. It's likely. Are you confident that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania? Well, probably not, especially if I hint that Philadelphia is not the capital of Pennsylvania. But that's subjective. As we all know, the confidence with which people express a judgment has very little correlation with the likelihood that it is actually true. Subjective. Confidence is inherently subjective. It's to do with the individual's personality, and it's not necessarily reflective of considered judgment. Probable is often used synonymously with likely, but it's plainly not synonymous with likely. If I say the probability that the capital of Philadelphia is Pennsylvania is 0.7, that's an absurd statement. Philadelphia either is the capital of Pennsylvania or it's not. Probable and likely do not mean the same thing. We'll come in a moment to what probable might mean. but it doesn't mean that. And probability is typically derived from a known or observable distribution. If we think of the ways in which people started to use probability, it was designed for the gambling table. It was then used for mortality tables. It was then used in highly repetitive manufacturing processes. All of them cases in which there was a known process that determined it, or you could determine the variety of outcomes by repeated observation of the process. That was what happened at the Guinness Brewery. At the gambling table, you knew you could work out the mathematics of that process. At the Guinness Brewery, you could observe the proportion of samples that were actually defective and know how many you actually had to test to see that a batch of beer was satisfactory. So these probabilities may be derived from a known or observable distribution. And the claim which was being made in that Friedman quote was that you could talk about subjective probabilities. We were talking again before the call about the term pygnistic. And the term pygnistic means, what would you be willing to bet on? And the Friedman argument rests ultimately on the point that people will be willing to take odds on every possible event. If I ask you what horse will win the Kentucky Derby in 2025, will it be horse A or horse B? And I'll say, I'll give you odds of 100 to 1 that Dobbin wins it in that. And you say, no bet. I say, how about if I offered you 1,000 to 1? And so on, until at some odds, you're willing to accept it. Now, if you want the reason why that story doesn't work, why it doesn't get us out of this kind of problem, there's, I think, no better explanation of it than the one I'm going to come to in a moment, which comes from Marlon Brando. Can we have the next slide, please?
On the day when I left home to make my way in the world, my daddy took me to one side. Son, my daddy says to me, I'm sorry I'm not able to bankroll you to a very large start, but not having the necessary letters to get you rolling. Instead, I'm going to stake you to some very valuable advice. One of these days in your travels, a guy is going to show you a brand new deck of cards on which the seal is not yet broken. Then this guy is going to offer to bet you that he can make the Jack of Spades jump out this brand new deck of cards and squirt cider in your ear. But son, do not accept this bet, because as sure as you stand there, you're going to wind up with an ear full of cider.
The point which is being made there is that uncertainty arises because we all have imperfect information. But although information is imperfect, information is also unequally distributed. And the reason it's foolish to bet on most things is that the person on the other side of the bet is very likely someone who has better information than you do. And that's why the statement, the probability that the capital of Pennsylvania's Philadelphia is 0.7 is absurd, because if I were to offer you a bet, what odds will you accept on the proposition that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania? You might well sensibly have a suspicion that I have a pretty good idea that the capital of Pennsylvania is actually Harrisburg. Certainly you would be foolish to bet on that kind of story. These pygnistic subjective probabilities simply do not exist. People sensibly and rationally do not attach probabilities to events when their knowledge is limited. So let's think a bit about how people really do think about uncertainty and how we ought to think about uncertainty. Let's move to the next slide. Uncertainty, as I described, is the product of imperfect information. And information is necessarily imperfect about most things, often about the present, certainly about the future. But knowledge about we know things about that future. We don't know, it's not the case that we know nothing about what will happen. We know something, but not very well. we thought of using Through a Glass Darkly as the title of the book for a bit, but it was rather too opaque, in fact. But it makes the point that we know a bit about the world, but not that much. And people talk about the wisdom of crowds, but the wisdom of crowds really rests in the aggregate of people's knowledge rather than in the average of people's knowledge. Now, uncertainty is not knowing what's going to happen. And uncertainty may be good or it may be bad. There's a distinction here, an important distinction, between risk and uncertainty, which is rather different from the one in which Keynes and Knight talked about it. Because uncertainty may be good or bad. Uncertainty is when you go to a new place or a new restaurant, and it may be better or worse than you expected. You don't know. But risk is something going wrong. Risk is that you go to the restaurant and it's terrible. And nobody ever talks about there's a risk I might win the national lottery, because people don't really expect to win the national lottery. And they don't even say there's a risk that I might not win the national lottery, because it's not some probable possibility they take seriously. Some uncertainty is what we describe as resolvable. It can be resolvable in one of two ways. It can be resolved probabilistically. These are things like the beer at the Guinness Brewery, where you didn't know what any particular batch was going to be like, but you knew the probabilities of getting particular qualities from particular brews. And then there's the uncertainty, which is resolvable because it's knowable but unknown. That's the problem, like what is the capital of the state of Pennsylvania? It's certainly a known fact, but you may not in fact know it. And a great deal of uncertainty can be resolved by learning more. Even if you learn more, as with Obama in the White House, that information may be insufficient in itself to dictate the action. And if uncertainty is not resolvable in one of these ways, it's resolvable probabilistically, it's resolvable by more sufficient information, we're in the territory of radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty can come from ambiguity and vagueness. We don't quite know what the problem is, far less the answer to it. Radical uncertainty, we don't know what the range of possible answers is. If I ask the question, what is going to happen in the Ukraine? The answer is, that's an ill-defined problem, even though it's a very real problem. And then we have radical uncertainty, where the underlying process is non-stationary, by which I mean the process changes over time. A pack of cards is a result, or the play of a pack of cards is a resolvable uncertainty, because the mathematics of that remain constant. A great deal of what we know about the physical world is stationary in this kind of sense. The motion and equations of planetary motion are stationary in the sense that we've known them, and we've known them for hundreds of years. And then there are processes which can be are called ergodic. They're where we learn about the probability distribution from experience. That's the mortality tables which actuaries were able to compile by looking at death statistics. But many processes in business and finance are non-stationary and non-ergodic. And the way we deal with radical uncertainty, we believe, is we work by reference to what we call reference narratives. We start to tell scenarios and stories, as in the kind of Linda case. We have a reference narrative, and what we mean by risk is something that will derail that reference narrative. And within the context of a secure reference narrative, uncertainty may be something to be welcomed. Uncertainty is not necessarily bad. Uncertainty, as Knight argued, gave the opportunities for entrepreneurship. But that's only uncertainty if you have some kind of stable narrative. Let's go to the next slide.
In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock.
That's, of course, Orson Welles in The Third Man. And Welles is half right, and he is half wrong. Firstly, Switzerland is actually the country which has most Nobel Prize winners per head of any country in the world. So the idea that Swiss innovation rests only in the cuckoo clock is not altogether convincing. And secondly, it's true that under Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. And that was pretty risky world for the Borgias, most of whom died of poison or in battle or whatever. But it wasn't like that for Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Both Michelangelo and Leonardo found well-heeled patrons and died in their beds, in Michelangelo's case, at a rather advanced age. For them, it was a stable environment with a secure reference narrative, even if it was uncertain in the obvious sense which Welles described. If you personally or collectively have a stable reference narrative, then you can embrace uncertainty. I once went to a seminar at which people were talking about the coming contest between US and China to be number one. And I said, I don't think this is really what we should be talking about. For most people, being number one in the world is being like Denmark. Denmark is the country that comes up top. If you ask people, are you happy? Are you contented with your lives? It's a very rich country. It is a very pleasant environment. Denmark, in terms of the kind of world's human development index that the United Nations construct, is number one. Actually, I think it's number 3, but you know what the countries at the top of that kind of list are. They're Canada, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark. And actually the former ambassador, British ambassador to Denmark in the room, was there, and he said, but Denmark is so boring. And of course, for an ambassador, Denmark is boring. You go to a round of agreeable cocktail parties at which people speak excellent English, and no world-shaking geopolitical events happen in Denmark. But if you look and see which countries have dealt with the pandemic most effectively, then you're not very surprised that it's countries like Denmark which come up on the top of that list. And that's perhaps a moment for me to stop and invite questions.
Phil, you had a comment.
First of all, I love the concept of non-stationarity of data. And I wonder whether Boris actually believes that the COVID environment and the COVID data is a stationary process. And then maybe that's one of the problems we're in. The other one was I love the comparison with Waze, and the comparison that you draw, and that you think that it's a brilliant way that economists should behave, because it uses data not to build general models, but to provide rapid access to information, suggesting a location of problems and possible solutions, and that maybe economists should behave more like Waze, more like drivers who use Waze. So pick one of those as you wish.
Right. I thought the comparison with Waze was actually a rather striking one, because for the last 50 years, economists have argued that the only way you can build a satisfactory macro model is to build it up from micro foundations. That is, you have to work from each individual person's behavior, and only in that way can you construct a general equilibrium model of the economy as a whole. And that sounds quite interesting at first sight. So if you're trying to predict how long it would take you to drive from Kilburn to Southwark, what you would need a model of everyone's driving plans and habits, and they would all optimize their plans given what they knew about other people's driving plans and habits, and so on. And then you could find the best way for you to make that particular trip. And you could also predict aggregate traffic problems in London. Actually, you know perfectly well that you couldn't even begin to do that because you can't conceive of having the knowledge and data which you need to do it. The way in which Waze works is it's extremely local data collection. It gets notice of where you are in your car, and it looks at the degree of traffic congestion in your immediate vicinity, and it gives you practical advice based on that particular knowledge tailored to your particular location and your particular intentions. As we say in the book, I think economists should be a lot more like Waze, going back to piecemeal models that are useful for particular problems.
A question for Richard Stokes. And just thinking, Richard, about you and your business, Agreco, how do you apply the concept of radical uncertainty to making decisions? You know, you have to consider what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. How are those decisions taken in reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't always necessarily do it terribly well. We do collect a lot of data, and it does help us inform, a lot of our decisions. But there's certainly a lot that is just unknown. One of the issues that we have is often collecting money from those people that owe it to us in various countries around the world. And a lot of our ability to collect that money is down to the political climates in those particular countries and the economies in those particular countries. Now, we can do what we can to mitigate a degree of that risk by getting paid to some extent before we provide a service. But that isn't always possible, and quite often, we actually have to take a punt on the basis of the information that we have. But quite often that is uncertain. It's not something that we can actually really craft any degree of mathematical probability around.
Other questions, comments?
I mean, one thing that's interesting in what Richard has said is that what Richard means by risk is something like not getting paid. As I said in my presentation, risk for most people, and certainly for all business people, is something bad. That means risk is not the same as uncertainty. And that's very different from the approach that is adopted in financial markets, the approach that is taken for granted in financial markets, which is that risk and uncertainty are the same, and they're the same as volatility. So I went once to a meeting at the Treasury between a group of defense contractors who undertook large projects for the government and some Treasury economists. And the issue was, what should these contractors be paid for the risk associated with the kind of projects that they took over? And the business people emphasized the risks which were inherent in all these kind of idiosyncratic projects and the huge overruns which there had been in various projects in the past, and explained that this was a very risky business. The economists, on the other hand, who had been educated in MBA courses and finance schools, explained that the risk associated with idiosyncratic projects was perfectly diversifiable, and the capital asset pricing model said that you really didn't need any premium at all to undertake projects of these kinds. And you can imagine that the business people looked across the table and wondered what kind of planet the people on the other side came from. And they just meant completely different things when they talked about risk. And that's why I started by saying we need to be a lot clearer in the language we use than we typically are.
There's loads of questions coming up now, John, and one from Steve Toft. Do you want to ask it, Steve, rather than me be your intermediary?
Yes, I'm just interested in this idea of the stable reference narrative. And could you give us an example of one?
There are stable reference narratives kind of at the aggregate social level. So that when I talked about Denmark, one of the principal reasons Denmark is well placed to deal with a pandemic is that people essentially feel secure against both economic risks and health risks. That doesn't mean the government guarantees them against health risks, but they have a sense that they will be looked after both in terms of care and in terms of finances, as well as possible if something goes wrong. And that contributes to the kind of social cohesion of Denmark, which means that people will observe social distancing measures and the like without too much legal pressure or sanction on them in order to do so. But equally at the individual level, we have reference narratives of this kind. If you are thinking about your retirement planning, for example, you can go to a financial advisor or you can get various online programs. And in both cases, you will be asked lots of questions. You know, how long do you expect to live? How much can you save? How much will you need to spend in retirement? And they'll even start asking you, what do you think interest rates are going to be in 20 years' time? And the sensible person's answer to almost all these questions is, I don't know. What you should be trying to do is to construct what we describe as a stable reference narrative, in which you say, what I want to do is to maintain at least roughly my current standard of living for the rest of my life. And then what is necessary in order to enable me to do that? And can I construct a realistic plan that gives me the possibility of doing that? And then what are the risks that might that might derail that? And you can see in between the two, the individual level and the national level, you should be asking the same questions when you're formulating strategy in business. That's what I mean about measuring risk and uncertainty in the context of a stable reference narrative.
So at a company level then, a stable reference narrative would be a clear purpose, a clear strategy, that kind of thing.
It's a clear strategy that is formulated and then asks itself, what are the major things that could go wrong with that strategy? What are the things that could derail it? We use in the book the words robust and resilient quite a lot. We can make that strategy robust and resilient to a future we don't know. And then two other words which come in because they're so much part of the way in which engineers think about robustness and resilience in complex systems are modularity, which means that part of the system can collapse without it jeopardizing the whole, and redundancy, which means you build in rather greater tolerances than the minimum you can get away with. And you can see when you think in these terms that whether we're talking about the financial crisis or the current pandemic, the elimination of modularity and redundancy, seeing these things as signs of inefficiency, led to a loss of robustness and resilience, which has inhibited our ability to handle these unexpected events.
And I guess one of the issues here is that which Richard Stokes kind of got into about how they make decisions about where to invest or where to put their energies and efforts. And a question here from Jenny DeValier kind of links to that a bit. She said, what's the role of leadership in navigating through radical uncertainty? What can leaders actually do? And just looking around the room, John, there are a lot of organizations here who have all sorts of issues associated with the topic you've addressed this morning. What do leaders actually do? What they should do more of?
Well, certainly there's a non-role for leader, which is, as it were, we don't have to worry about uncertainty because the leader is the man who knows, or he claims he's the man who knows, and we have to look at the future on that kind of basis. What leadership actually involves, and this goes back to the point I made about the wisdom of crowds lying in the aggregate of knowledge, not, as it were, the average of knowledge. Leadership in this sense is about aggregating the knowledge both within the organization and outside it that might go into undertaking that strategy. And I started what I had to say by talking about Obama and the Bin Laden raid. And that was essentially what Obama was doing, spending a great deal of time talking to all of the people who might have the information relevant to that decision, both about the issue of whether it was Obama in the compound or not, but also equally importantly, what the consequences would be if it either were or it weren't Obama in the compound. It was trying to design a strategy which was robust and resilient in that sense, in the way in which the superficially similar operation in 1979, when Carter ordered the attempt to rescue the Iranian hostages, which failed. That was a scheme which was not robust and resilient enough to the risks, considerable risks entailed in either of these missions.
And Beata, I know you're on holiday, so it's probably wrong to pick on you, but how does what John said this morning apply to your particular business?
Well, actually, I do not know, but it's very interesting to hear your views on modeling, which I work for a private equity firm, which obviously at the early stage of evaluating any opportunity, there is a lot of work on modeling. And I would probably say more often than not, they're wrong. The base case scenario almost never comes through. But it's, we still make money and we still deliver good results. But it's not because we have modeled things correctly, but more, and again, this may be my wrong perception, but it is more of the amount of work and the deep sector knowledge that people have, which is something that we don't collect data on, and we can't quantify how right they were. We just don't do this. I can't say whether it's expertise and internalized experience that sounds like gut feel at times, and having a network of experts that makes us successful. Because if I would just look at modeling and how it was in the base case, and then 3 years down the line, we would get it wrong most of the time.
I spent part of my career commercially building models for people. And I came to realize that one was virtually never building a model as a basis for people making a business decision. One was building a model to enable people to justify decisions they had made, either internally or to some external agency. That left one very skeptical about modeling, but still modeling is useful in the main use of modeling. Well, two clear situations. One is you talk about 5-year plans and so on. And it's important, I think, for any startup business to develop that kind of plan, not because it's going to bear any relation to the reality of the outcomes, but it's a template for enabling you to think about all the issues which will be involved in doing that. And that leads into the value of modeling more generally, which is it's a way of organizing your thoughts, and it's a way of identifying the parameters that really matter to outcomes. It's not a way of making decisions.
There are a couple of comments on the chat line here, but rather than go through that, anybody got a final question before we finish at 1 o'clock? Neil Folger, you've been very quiet again this morning. What comment on what John's got to say?
Well, so I was following Stephen's line of thinking here. So I was fascinated. So I thought that the whole concept that there was a narrative that actually described, if you go back through human history, that was describing what was around us. So, and you could say that probability and everything that we've been doing is a part of adjusting that narrative as we gain more knowledge. But we're still left with unknowable things, and therefore our narrative still is important to manage those unknowables. And it got me thinking about business strategy as a consequence. So much like Stephen was thinking, if you have a business strategy which is your narrative, then how do you continue to adjust that strategy? So, and what's the appropriate timeline to do that? Who does it? And I think, John, you described that it is the CEO or it is the senior person there, but taking as much as possible into account. But I would always be interested to understand whether there is a reliable, should we say, adjustment in narrative depending on the size of the grouping that you're talking about. So an individual may have a narrative which works for them personally over 20 years, but maybe over 10 minutes. So an organization may have one that works for 3 years, but maybe doesn't hold up long enough. Have you discovered something on the, if you like, the timeline associated with the evolution of a narrative?
I think the evolution of narrative is actually continuous, should be continuous. That is, it's not a matter of we have a 5-year plan and every 5 years we look at it again and see if it's the right plan. And that's really the way in which you're describing, which all the techniques we're talking about, whether they're modeling or simulation or probabilistic thinking or anything else, they're feeding into that adjustment to the narrative over time. So I think that's a continuous process. And you talk about the role of the CEO. I think I've been very taken by the concept which has been described as the mediating hierarchy. You need a hierarchy in the sense that there needs to be a process for making decisions, knowing that the decision has been made and knowing what it is when it is made. But that's not the same as the CEO actually making the decision. It's a matter of, as it were, ratifying a decision which comes from a more emergent process. And I think that's the way in which to respond to the question which was raised earlier. Effective leadership helps people cope with radical uncertainty.
Brilliant. We're past 1 o'clock, which is where we said we'd finish. John, you said you've got a new book. What's it called?
It's called Greed is Dead.
Is it a good read?
It's a very good read. It's very much shorter than Radical Uncertainty. It's much more written for our political times. But the thesis is essentially that individualism, both in the sense of its underpinning for market fundamentalism and the kind of expressive identity which we see expressed in more and more extreme forms on the streets, in universities, etc., that both of these have actually been very destructive to the kind of social cohesion that is actually the basis for the stable reference narratives at the national level, which I've been describing.
Well, if anybody hasn't read Radical Uncertainty, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call haven't, it's well worth a read. It's a good book, but it's easy to read. So, John, thank you very much for your insights and your contributions this morning. First class as ever. And thanks to the audience for participating, and hope everybody has a nice and coolish afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.